This is the Editor's Half Hour. Step into the life of an editor for 30 minutes as we discuss the craft of editing, industry trends, and editorial resources. Your host is co-founder and CEO of Peak Publishing Inc., Nadia Jaja Pupa. She is experienced in all facets of the publishing industry, from editing to design, and works with corporate clients and self-published authors. Nadia and her guests are about to share powerful insights and stories on what it takes to be an editor. And this is your host, Nadia Jaja Pupa.
Welcome, listeners, to the Editor's Half Hour. We have a great topic to cover in this episode, and I have a great guest, an expert on this topic, which is working with EFL writers. So welcome, Mekiya Outini. He is the owner of a company called the DateKeepers. I am so excited to have you today to cover a topic that editors tend to not cover as much. So welcome. Please introduce yourself and tell our listeners about you, your company, and what you're working on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nadia. I appreciate your having me on. As you said, my name is Mekiya Outini. I am an editor, and I have been for over 10 years. I've got experience working in university writing centers, teaching college-level English. I'm also a writer myself. I write fiction and nonfiction, and I've got an MFA in fiction. And it was through those university writing centers that I started working with a lot of international students who were coming to me for support on their papers. And over time, I ended up developing expertise working with EFL writers just because I got so much exposure to people coming from so many different linguistic and cultural backgrounds. And I started to see patterns and trends that could be useful at a more abstract level.
That's great. And I love that you kind of started to seek patterns in this, which is so interesting. So tell us a little bit about your wife. I love that you're a husband and wife team. I have a loose husband and wife team with Peak Publishing. My husband is a co-founder, and he brings his design expertise to the table. And I was just talking to him the other day. I thought, I need to get my husband on the podcast. I think he's got a lot to share that editors could benefit from hearing. But tell us a little bit about how you met your wife, and then when you had the idea, like, let's work together, let's make a company. How did that happen? How did that come to fruition?
Yeah, for sure. So our company is the DateKeepers, and my wife's name is Itto Outini. I actually took her last name when we got married. And we offer a full range of author support. So basically everything we didn't have and everything that authors usually are not provided, even if they go through a formal training or go through an MFA program, for example. So we offer book coaching, editorial services, all different types of editing from developmental down to proofreading. We provide marketing support, promotional support, negotiation training for people who are wanting to work with partners or potentially sign a deal with a publishing house. We help people choose a path to publication because for some people that might be self-publishing is more appropriate. Some people actually might benefit from working with a hybrid. Others would not benefit from working with a hybrid publisher and would want to go traditional and might want to go with a large publishing house, a small publishing house. So there are a lot of decisions to be made along that decision tree, and we help guide the author through that process and figure out what's going to be right for their manuscript. We help prepare that manuscript. So anything that we don't provide, for example, design services, we also have people in our network who do, so we often refer out clients. And we just try to provide as much as we can under one roof so that authors don't have to keep bouncing from one professional to another.
I love that. I love that you keep it in-house as much as possible and really guide the writer, because a lot of writers, they have a lot that they want to share with the world, but it could be very daunting to go through the publishing process, even the writing process, without that help. So it sounds like you're there to help the writers navigate everything, which is very cool.
Right. Well, and most of us did not get into writing because we are very enthusiastic business people. I mean, there are a few.
Right.
My wife is one of them actually, but there's not many of us, and most of us we just want to focus on the art. But she and I have had to teach ourselves everything from the ground up, and so now that we've acquired those skills and that knowledge, we want to pass that on so that other writers can benefit from what we didn't have.
I love that. That's so great. And I'm sure that the writers very much appreciate you for that, which is so cool. So let's talk about EFL writers. I would like to ask a very baseline, very probably, foundational question before we get deeper into this topic. But you hear ESL. So what's the difference? Is there a difference? ESL and EFL writers. Can you clarify that for us before we dive in today?
Sure, there is a difference. Sometimes it is negligible. ESL means English as a second language, and EFL means English as a foreign language. EFL is more of an umbrella term because you can acquire English as a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh language in my wife's case. Or you can, if you learn it as your second language, then you're an ESL writer. And many people have only two languages, which is already pretty impressive because you've got to do a lot of just internal translation and internal interpretation before you even get to the writing process. But if you've got more than two and English is not your second, then you would need to use the term EFL. But if you use the term EFL, it's generally a safe and appropriate term because it applies to everyone who is working in English and it's not their native language.
So let's dive into it. So, what were some of those patterns that you recognized when you were working with EFL writers? What were some of the things that you saw that they needed a little extra help in? And then you were able, identifying those things. Can you list a few of those? And of course, we'll get into it a little deeper in the conversation.
Sure. So the first thing I should say is there is a tremendous amount of variation because different languages, the language and culture are very closely intertwined, and different languages and different cultures interfere with English writing in different ways because each language has its own set of idiomatic and grammatical and syntactical rules that govern what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and they also have their own sets of reference points that govern what's legible and not legible in those languages. And then you've got individual variations between clients because they might come from the same cultural background, but come from very different socioeconomic classes, have had access to different levels of formal English instruction starting at different periods in their lives. And then you've also just got differences that are probably more intrinsic than that even. Like some people gravitate more toward spoken language, others gravitate more toward written language, and you might have a stronger set of skills in one or the other.
I see.
So it is difficult to abstract rules out from that because there's so much variation. So a few things that I've found that tend to hold true. One is when we draw this distinction between proofreading and copy editing, that can be very useful in some contexts. If we're working on a book, for example, and putting it through multiple rounds of editing, and we just have the galley copy and we just need to make sure everything is good, but we just need to make sure the commas are good to go. That's a great instance of a context where that distinction is important and useful. But when working with EFL clients, especially international students, academics, and you're working in a freelance capacity and not with a publishing house, it actually can do more harm than good. So I've had a ton of clients come to me and say, hey, I worked with an editor and they said they were going to make my writing clear and help me. And I paid them however much, like $200, $500, $1,000. And then I got it back and they only changed like the commas and the spelling and the punctuation. And it still doesn't make sense when my friends read it and they tell me this doesn't make sense in English. And so I was like, okay, what's happening here? What's happening is I think too many editors take for granted that when somebody hires a proofreader, they know where proofreading stops and copy editing starts. And that a lot of lay people don't. Even if they're native English speakers, if they're not in the writing world, it's just not part of their daily lexicon, right?
Right.
So, but especially when you're coming to work in a foreign language and you've already got all of these other layers of like meaning interfering with what you're trying to do, that's just one more interference pattern to deal with.
Yeah.
So what I found much more useful is I'll assess where each of those writers, where their work is at the moment that I take them on as a client. And usually I will draw a distinction between developmental editing, structural editing, and then copy editing / proofreading. Those tend to be useful distinctions.
Yes.
Although, because it's recursive, sometimes we end up doing some of one and some of another in one round. So I try not to be too rigid in dividing those rounds of editing. And my primary goal helping clients is am I making your work clear? And am I making it sound the way you would sound if you were writing this in your native language,
Mm-hmm.
except to an English speaking audience. So again, I've worked mainly with academics in this capacity.
Right.
And I should clarify that at the DateKeepers, we don't exclusively serve EFL writers or international students. We work with a lot of native English speaking writers too. But I'm talking about specifically working with international students, which is
Right.
where I've got a lot of experience. They want to sound professional because the stakes are quite high. They
Oh,
want
yeah.
their papers to be read and reviewed with at the same level that native speakers would be,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't they don't really care about the aesthetics as much. So we don't need to worry as much about preserving or altering that client's quote unique voice, because what they want their unique voice to sound like is like a professional academic. So
Right. Right.
that's another challenge. That it's always a challenge because we always do have to make sure that we're not writing like overwriting for the writer. We're not taking over their voice
Right.
and
You don't
writing in
want
our
to,
voice instead. And
yeah. You don't want to take it so far
yeah,
where
no,
you're
and
like overtaking their writing. I totally get that. Yeah.
right. And especially with more creative writers, when they're working in like fiction or creative nonfiction, that can be an insult. But when
Oh,
you're working
yeah.
with academic writers, that work is functional more than it is aesthetic. So it's more important to make sure that their meaning is clear, and that sometimes involves heavier rewriting. Now, anytime we actually rewrite passages, we want to say, okay, here's why I did the thing I did. Here's how you can do
Okay.
it next time. Here's where that wouldn't work. Here's where you wouldn't want to use this idiom, for example, or this syntactical structure. So you do want to be very hands-on, and the more communication there is, the better.
That's
Another
great.
thing to keep in mind is that because some writers are more comfortable with spoken English and some with written English, and as with most things, this also applies to native speakers, but the stakes are higher with non-native speakers.
Right.
Um, it, all else being equal, I think it's easier to communicate about these things verbally because they can ask questions. If they don't understand something, you can respond. But sometimes they might not feel as comfortable in spoken English. Sometimes they might know all the vocabulary and syntax and grammar, but they might not have the ear for the language yet. Sometimes they're
Mm-hmm.
in a different time zone, and there's just not a good time to meet. So sometimes we do have to fall back on the written language, and so it's important to be clear and precise and explain why you've done what you've done,
Mm-hmm.
and help the client understand, because that way they will actually learn and be able to apply those rules next time.
So let's walk through the whole process of when you are onboarding a new client. What process do they go through? Do you have like a intake form? What is your assessment process on what level is required? And then this is a two-part question. So what is it like on onboarding? And then how do you evaluate what they give you? Do you have a system in place
Mhm.
where you're like, okay, this is the level of editing required, and then how do you communicate that to the client without, you know, um overwhelming them, because they're like, what is developmental
Mhm.
editing? What in the hell is what's the difference? They don't know the difference between proofreading and copy editing. I mean, there's a lot there. So how do you handle all that? That seems to me overwhelming, but I'd love to get some insight about this.
Sure. Well, I try to keep things as simple as possible, so I don't have an intake form. Usually, I will either have an initial phone call with the person, or if a phone call wouldn't work for one reason or another, we'll communicate by email, and I'll ask these questions by email. But the first thing I always assess is what are you writing, and how well do you understand the material? Like, let's say it's in your native language, like you're thinking in your head. How well can you explain to yourself what you're doing in your head in your native language? Um, and that's not always the easiest thing to assess because we're not working in their native language, we're working in English. But the
Right.
questions I ask are designed to sort of triangulate how deep their knowledge is so that I know, and I'll get to this in terms of how I assess their material in just a minute. But so I'll ask about the content. I'll ask, what field are you working in? What type of document is this? And then I'll ask them to summarize what they're doing. If it's something that they're working on for a class or for an advisor, I'll ask them to tell me what their advisor told them to do. I'll ask
Okay,
them
that's
to,
interesting.
if they're doing original. Yeah, because I don't want to interfere with what their advisor said and give them feedback that would contradict that, for example.
Right.
Even if their advisor's feedback seems counterintuitive, I'm always going to try to work around that. And sometimes it does, but that's
Yeah.
academic advisors for you. But and also often, I don't know the field. I don't know
Right.
I don't have the content knowledge, and they have the content knowledge. The advisor
Right.
has the content knowledge. I'm learning that from them. So that's another sort of joyful thing I find about this process is I learn a lot from working with international students,
I'm
not just about the language and
sure.
culture, but also about like the disciplines that they're working in. So sometimes it goes more quickly and sometimes it takes longer, but I ask them to explain as much as they can about the topic to me. If they've done original research, like how did you do it? What was the method? Like what was the methodology? What were the findings? Whose work are you citing and why? And I ask those questions in as many different ways as I can think of until I feel like they've understood the question and are answering it. And then I'm also learning during that process because it'll be more feasible for me to edit that paper if I understand what it's about, because meaning and structure interact. So once I have that conversation with them, I ask them to send me over a sample of the paper or whatever document they're working on. And I'll assess that. My initial assessment is not always accurate because I base that on other papers that I've done that are in the same field and that have that are at approximately the same level of grammatical cleanliness and clarity. But of course, there's many other factors that can influence how long an editing project takes. But you asked about the assessment process. I have 3 tiers, I suppose you could say, three questions that I ask. First, do you understand the material in your own language? Second, do you understand the material in your own language and you have a solid enough grasp on English to communicate the concepts to me in some form, verbal or written? Like, let's say they can't do it written, but they can do it verbally. That's the second tier. It's not the first. Third, do they understand that content knowledge deeply and they can communicate it relatively well in English, and the only issues they're having are grammatical and idiomatic issues. So that third category is going to be the simplest, easiest editorial project. It's still going to be relatively time consuming and whatnot, but if they can understand the content knowledge and they also have a relatively strong grasp of the language, and the grammar is is where most of the work needs to be done. I'll still need to help them with rephrasing a lot of sentences, but I can infer from what they've written what they mean, which makes the whole process a whole lot easier. It's a lot less back and forth. I'm like, okay, this is syntactically not working, but it's close enough. I know what you're saying.
I see.
And I'm not afraid that I'm going to change your meaning by rewriting this in the way that would be more clear and appropriate to your given meaning. Now, the next layer down, they know it and they can communicate it verbally, or in some form, but it's just not happening on the page. That takes longer because it's a lot more back and forth. I either have to write a lot of notes and say, here's what I think you mean, but did you really mean this? And here's how you would say it if you mean this, but here's how you would say it if you mean that. And here's how you would say it if you, I have to give them sometimes 3 or 4 different options. And that's just for one sentence, right? So it takes them a lot longer. Sometimes we have to do multiple rounds just to communicate about, and I always say, with all my clients, I say, look, I'm not an expert in the content knowledge, so review what I've done carefully. It's possible that I've made a mistake and I've rewritten something in a way that counters what you intended to say. Check for that. Always check for that. I'm not infallible. I'm doing my best and I have the language, but I don't have the content knowledge. So we're gonna have to work together on that. But that risk becomes higher as their capacity to communicate in written English goes down. And then the third, and this is a very rare client, by the way, but I have worked with clients who just don't understand the content knowledge or the language.
Oh my gosh.
And it's rare because there are filters in the academic system, but sometimes people slip through those filters for various reasons. So I worked with one client on one occasion who was a master's student in biology and was trying to write a paper. It might have been a thesis. I can't remember, about nanotechnology. And at some point and this was actually when I wasn't freelancing at this point. I was working with a writing center, and at some point I realized this person didn't know what nanotechnology was.
Oh no.
So,
Oh,
I
that's
had to
very
go and start
stressful.
learning a lot about. Right?
Nanotechnology.
No, I yeah.
Are you?
So,
Are you?
and I don't know.
I know. I was going to
I know
ask.
it's small.
Are you? Are you a nanotechnology expert now?
I demyelinated a lot of that information after, like, I absorbed what I could to
Yeah.
help this client, and
Yeah.
and so that again, that's a rare client. It's
Right.
much more likely that this person has a clear understanding of what they're writing. They just it's hard for them to get it on the page.
Yeah.
But it does sometimes. So that's why I include that as a possible category. Like, and it is a meaningful distinction, because if someone knows what they want to say but they just don't know how to say it, it's very different than if they don't know what they want to say or how they want to say it.
So, do you take notes when you're going through a manuscript or an article or a thesis? Are you jotting down notes? Okay, the message is that you understand the message that they're trying to make, but then it would maybe be an idiom that you would need to adjust, or because it could be a variety of different things too as you go through a document. Um, is that what you do? So, just I want to tap inside your head a little bit on how you actually go through a manuscript or a Word doc.
Sure. So usually I'll do the first read through and I'll make comments, which I'm writing the comments for the client, but the first draft of those comments is more for me.
Yes,
And I'll go back through the comments and I'll reword them. I'm like, okay, I understand what I said, but did I say it in the most clear possible way? Is it gonna click with them? And so I always sort of do a second draft of my own comments just to
I
make
love
sure
it.
that they are going to be more legible. But yeah, I always kind of imagine that I'm talking to the client, even if I'm writing in a way that might not be as clear to them on the first round.
I see.
So I'll do the initial read through and comments simultaneously. I try to save costs for my clients where I can, so I don't do a read through and then do comments. I do the read through and the comments simultaneously. And then I will usually do another round that's copy editing / proofreading. Sometimes I'll even say, sometimes that's multiple rounds, right? If their English was not clear enough for me to be confident that I knew what they were trying to say, I'll say we're going to have to do another round on this because I need you to check and make sure that I understood what you were trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
You need to pick from the choose your own adventure of like the 4 sentences that I wrote for you that could explain each of these potential meanings. Like, it's going to take more than one round.
That's great support,
that's the
though.
intermediate stage.
That's the support they need. That's amazing. And I love hearing this from you, because I think our listeners are going to really benefit from approaching this type of work in a more concise way and not be overwhelmed by it, because I think a lot of editors tend to jump immediately to the next level and say, this is too much work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to have to charge extra.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about pricing. Do you charge a flat fee? Do you charge an hourly rate? Are you a hybrid of both? And do the clients understand that there is that an added layer of work required on your part? And then my second question is, do you do sample edits for free? Do you or do you they have to pay first before you do the assessment? How does that work?
So I don't do sample edits for free. I do an initial phone call or email exchange for free, and I do a quick skim. I read it, like I sort of skim it quickly to assess the grammatical clarity, like the how strong or weak the grammar is, for free. Beyond that, I charge for everything, including the more thorough read through, which again I do concurrently with the comments. I mean, in the industry, prices vary a lot. So like there's editors out there who charge $5 on Upwork for $5 an hour, and you probably get what you pay for, but
Right.
they exist. And then you've got, I think the Editorial Freelancers Association puts the range for most copy editing projects between like 40 and 70 an hour, but there's people who charge 200, 300 an hour. So there's a lot of variety. I usually charge per hour, and I usually base rate is $100 an hour. I will sometimes increase that price depending on the complexity. Like if I'm going to be learning nanotechnology, for example, if that had been a freelance client, I would have, I would have increased that price. Um, Again, that's quite a rare circumstance. But if, for example, if they do understand what they're trying to write, but they just the written English skills are just not there, and we have to have a lot of like verbal communication. I have to do more actual composition for them, and then teaching so that they can do that next time. That's I'm going to charge more for that. If they're in the category where their grammar needs work and their idioms are not clear, but pretty much everything else is in place, and you just need to do sort of, I call it light syntactical work, even though it is actually fairly heavy, but it's light in relation to the other types of copy editing that an EFL writer might need.
Okay.
So that's where I'm going to charge my base rate of $100 per hour.
Okay.
And I try to give a clear cost estimate, but like I said, the more familiar I am with a writer's work, the better my estimate's going to be. So if I've got a client who I've worked with many times, I can give them a very precise estimate up front, just based on that quick skim and the initial conversation about the project. If it's a new client, it might require, like, I might give them an estimate and then say, hey, I've done part of this and it actually needs more work than I initially expected, but I'm always going to ask them for permission to proceed before doing extra work and charging them more than I initially quoted them. Yeah.
So you're never going to just take it and run with it. You're going to always have them as part of that conversation,
Right.
which is so smart and great. So I have one fun question to ask. In your years of experience, are there any, because this is from the other side as a, a native English speaker, what are some of those idioms or phrases are there any that you've seen a pattern that EFL writers have struggled with that are typically American? The reason I'm asking this is, so I have an Arabic background, and sometimes there are just some words that are just really hard to translate into English, like a word that can encompass a full phrase that means a full-on thing, and then it would require at least 2 sentences to explain what one word means in another language. I'm just curious. Do you have any insight on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a good example because it's rare when you have a word that cannot be translated. Usually the problem is it's going to take so much extra verbiage to translate it that is it worth it? Is it contributing enough to the meaning that the English reader is going to get that it's worthwhile? Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's worth adding a whole paragraph of cultural context that the Arabic speaker, for example, would not need because that's just part of the cultural background, but the English speaker won't understand that passage unless they have an extra set of context. Sometimes it's not.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, idioms vary a lot from different backgrounds. I do notice that what are they? Not compound verbs, like phrasal verbs tend to be a real challenge for a lot of
that's where your
EFL speakers.
and that's where your editorial expertise comes into play, because now you're saying, is it worth that extra effort and extra words to add to clarify those things? So that's interesting.
Phrasal verbs are interesting because they can disrupt my reading, because sometimes the writer will use a phrasal verb that is aesthetically very similar, but it means something very different if they either drop the preposition or they use a different preposition, and that's sometimes big conversations come out of that about, like, what did you mean here? What did you mean here? So that's an example of where a relatively small change can make a big difference in terms of the clarity. And once you know what you're going to change, it's easy, but sometimes the big changes are actually not as difficult to tackle as the little changes that you don't even really register as errors. You just think they mean something other than they do.
I see. Well, I'm glad I asked that question. It's great to get some clarity on what, the editor has to handle on the editor side. So we do have to wrap up this conversation. I would love to end on some positive messages for the editor, for the listener, on what it takes to work with EFL writers. So just doing this podcast episode, I feel, is contributing to, the industry-wide culture on acknowledging that EFL writers are out there and they need assistance and they need help. So what are some some ways that we can cultivate this? What are some ways that as editors we can start putting a spotlight on EFL writers and understanding that, we don't know everything. How do we do this? How do we spread the knowledge about this area of the world?
Sure. Well, I don't know if I want to speak on behalf of anyone other than myself, but I will say the way I look at this is it's not an extra burden. It's not like a population that needs saving. It's an opportunity for me to learn a bunch of really cool stuff about another language, another culture, and usually another field of study, and to have some really interesting conversations. So I end up learning as much, hopefully, as the client does. And I don't know. I think if an editor is approaching the project thinking that they need to, provide a service to a population who is historically underserved, like that's probably not going to be as productive a framing, because then we're going to be approaching the client as a savior, and we're not a savior. We're a collaborator. We're working on that project with them. We're going to be learning as we go along. It's going to be really rewarding, hopefully, for us as well as for the client. And I think that attitude will probably go a long way toward improving the services provided to EFL writers.
I love that. That was so well said. And I'm so glad that I had you on the podcast. I think everything that you shared makes working with EFL writers within reach and not out of reach. And I think that the more knowledge and information we share, the better it is for editors out there who are, more willing to take on clients who need that extra help. So I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for your time, Mekiya. This was very insightful, and I hope we've inspired our listeners to learn more about what it takes to work with EFL writers. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nadia. I really appreciate it.
Hey, listeners, don't go away just yet. We have a really quick announcement to make. I have Katira here. We have partnered on a really exciting thing, which is the 2025 Editor's Calendar. I'd like to hand it over to Katira to share some information about why we're doing this and the exciting news.
Yes, thank you so much, Nadia. And yes, I had this idea a few years ago, actually, and just never acted on it, but I wanted to create a calendar to bring editors to the forefront. We all know we do lots of work behind the scenes that sometimes goes unrecognized. So I wanted to create opportunity for people to see the people behind the book magic that is out there. So I'm super excited to collaborate with Nadia. And Nadia, of course, has created the editing affirmation cards, and I saw the graphic design on those and decided I wanted her to help me with my calendar. So that is why I specifically tapped Nadia, and I'm excited that all of our spots are full for the calendar already, and excited to see so many powerful and prominent and successful and also down-to-earth editors who have signed up to join the calendar. So thank you, Nadia, for your support and collaborating with me. If you're interested in purchasing the 2025 Editor's Calendar, feel free to email me at Poland, that's POLLAND, at love4words.com, and I'll be happy to get you signed up to get your copy. And thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Editor's Half Hour. This podcast is your go-to resource for editorial trends, opening the discussion for new ideas through the real-life stories of editors. For more information about Nadia Jaja Pupa and her business, visit peakpublishing.com. That's PIQUE publishing.com. And remember to subscribe and follow the Editor's Half Hour wherever you get your podcasts.